No one expected Pam Bondi to be the one who uncovered the missing millions. For years, she'd been known as Florida's former attorney general, tough on crime, a relentless prosecutor, someone unafraid to call out corruption, even when it came from within her own party. She'd returned to private life after her term ended, staying out of the spotlight. But that changed the day a friend in the New York State Comptroller's office sent her a folder labeled simply, Federal Grant Allocations, Internal Use Only. At first glance, it looked like ordinary government paperwork, spreadsheets, line items, fiscal reports. Nothing flashy. But Pam Bondi didn't just skim through documents. She dissected them. Buried in the stack were line items that didn't sit right. Large federal grants were being funneled into vaguely named initiatives: Equity Compliance Task Force, Restorative Outreach Units, Community Healing Corps. There were no descriptions, no outcomes, no contact information. Just seven-figure amounts and administrative sign-offs. Pam began making calls. The more she looked, the worse it got. Several programs had the same mailing address, a UPS store in Brooklyn. One group had received over $20 million in a single year yet had no active website. Another, listed as a mental health outreach initiative, had hosted 3 events, costing taxpayers nearly $870,000. And then there were the names. Letitia James' office appeared again and again, signing off on the allocations. It wasn't just incompetence. It was a pattern. Pam didn't go to the press. She knew how the machine worked. Instead, she went to Congress, specifically to a rising voice on the Oversight Committee, Representative Jasmine Crockett, a firebrand Democrat from Texas known for her sharp cross-examinations and unapologetic defense of marginalized communities. To Pam's surprise, Crockett listened. A hearing was scheduled. It wasn't expected to make waves, just another routine oversight meeting. Until the press got wind of it. When Bondi agreed to testify, the headlines started rolling. Ex-AG Pam Bondi to present evidence of massive federal spending misuse in New York. Letitia James said nothing. No interviews. No press conferences. No tweets. And that silence only made things louder. On the morning of the hearing, Pam Bondi arrived in a gray suit and a calm expression. In her hand, a manila folder thick with verified documents. On a flash drive, the receipts. Behind the dais, members of Congress made small talk. Crockett sat in the center, glancing over notes but saying little. The cameras were rolling, but few expected what came next. Pam stepped to the mic. "This isn't about politics," she said. "It's about money. Your money. And what's been done with it." The first slide appeared on the screen behind her, a wire transfer of $3.2 million from a federal education grant, rerouted to a private consulting firm operating out of a UPS drop box. No phone number. No staff. No trace. Another slide, $8.7 million from a public health outreach fund, spent on colonial trauma sound therapy for fewer than 100 participants. Another, $9 million given to a housing nonprofit created 2 months before receiving funds, with no employees and no property listed. And then came the stamp, approved by the Office of the New York Attorney General. Letitia James. The committee went silent. Representative Crockett narrowed her eyes. She asked sharply, "Are you alleging criminal intent, Ms. Bondi?" Pam didn't flinch. "I'm not making accusations. I'm showing patterns. If this were happening in Florida, I'd be demanding answers too." There was no shouting. No partisanship. Just data and questions. But something was missing. A final slide appeared. "The source of this analysis is too complex to summarize here," Pam said. "But the person who compiled the raw data will be joining us shortly." She paused. "He's arriving in 1 hour." The committee stirred. "And he's bringing the rest of the story." The room shifted. Staffers whispered. Reporters scrambled to update their feeds. This wasn't just a paper trail anymore. This was an operation. And Pam Bondi was just getting started. The clock ticked loudly in the hearing room as staffers hurried back to their seats. Phones buzzed. Aides whispered. Reporters adjusted their cameras, waiting for the moment Pam Bondi had promised. When the side door opened, there was no entourage. No security detail. No spectacle. Pam Bondi walked back in, this time not alone. She was followed by a middle-aged man in a tailored suit, rolling a small black laptop bag. His name wasn't on the docket, and most people in the room didn't recognize him. But in the world of forensic accounting, Dr. Eric Delaney was a quiet legend, a former federal investigator turned private analyst, known for uncovering fraud rings embedded in nonprofit and municipal grant systems. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't political. But his numbers didn't lie. Pam took her seat. Eric opened his laptop, connected it to the display, and adjusted the mic. "I'm not here for headlines," he said. "I'm here to walk you through the data." And with that, the numbers started pouring in. The first graph was simple, a 3-year trend of federal funds sent to New York. The spike wasn't the story. Population growth and inflation could explain that. The story was in the distribution. Instead of going toward infrastructure, public safety, or education, 31.2% of the funds were being redirected into vague categories: social equity reform, restorative justice platforms, diversity access programs. Not one of these programs had federally defined benchmarks. No oversight. No audit trail. Eric clicked again. A map of New York State lit up with red and yellow markers, each one a program that had received over $1 million. Dozens shared addresses. Many had the same board members. Some listed no staff at all. It didn't look like public service infrastructure. It looked like a laundering network built out of acronyms and abstraction. Pam interjected, pointing to one cluster. "This group of nonprofits," she said, "all report to one fiscal agent. They've received over $42 million combined. And yet, none have filed Form 990s for the last fiscal year." Representative Jasmine Crockett, seated near the front, leaned forward. She raised a hand. "Are you saying these entities never existed? Or that they were created for the purpose of redirecting funds?" Eric paused, measured. "I'm saying we followed up on the physical addresses. One was an abandoned building. Another, a 400-square-foot co-working space that had no signage and no activity. In several cases, we found locked doors and no operating staff. No community programs. No public documentation." He clicked again. This time the slide showed an entity called Access for All, recipient of $12.4 million over 2 fiscal years. When Eric's team visited the address listed in Brooklyn, they found a shuttered office with no utilities and no registered mail activity for over 18 months. Pam added, "And yet this nonprofit is still receiving quarterly disbursements as of last month." The room was quiet. Tension thickened. More visuals came next, screenshots of wire transfers with generic memo lines like community outreach, healing sessions, and restorative impact. One such payment was $2.2 million, approved by Letitia James' office, to a group that hosted 2 meditation circles in a city park and distributed 300 flyers. Then came the moment that pulled the air out of the room. Eric clicked to a final slide. The total amount of federal funds identified as routed to non-compliant or unverifiable programs, he said, stands at $26.7 million over 30 months. Gasps were audible. One Republican member muttered, "Jesus." Jasmine Crockett held her composure, but her tone sharpened. "Are you asserting that the Office of the New York Attorney General willfully misrepresented how these funds would be used?" Pam Bondi didn't flinch. "I'm asserting that every one of these approvals bears a signature traceable to Letitia James' office. The intent is not for me to prove, but the pattern is unmistakable. Programs with no oversight, grants with no verification, and funds, your funds, gone." Another committee member raised the idea that this could all be the result of bureaucratic inefficiency. Maybe clerical errors. Maybe the programs were just delayed. Eric looked up. "In my career," he said, "I've seen bureaucratic mistakes. They leave a paper trail. They get corrected. This is something else. This is architecture." Pam leaned into the mic. "You don't accidentally approve $870,000 to a sound bath workshop for 74 participants." It landed hard. And Letitia James? Still absent. Her seat sat empty. The chair acknowledged that James' office had been given multiple invitations to respond. They declined. No representative. No comment. And that silence, that refusal to engage, now spoke volumes. Pam changed direction. She clicked to a new slide, marked Program Outcomes. Let's talk about the impact, she said. This isn't just about missing money. It's about broken promises. She pointed to one grant, $7.9 million, to an educational initiative meant to improve minority graduation rates in upstate New York. Graduation rates had declined. Another, $5.3 million, to a public health campaign that hosted 3 events over 2 years. No permanent staff. No doctors. Just social media graphics and rented folding chairs. This isn't about whether equity matters, Pam said, her voice steady. It's about whether the people responsible are delivering the results they promised. Representative Crockett, who had remained calm but visibly disturbed, finally asked, "If this were happening in Texas, would you be sitting in that chair?" Pam nodded. "If I saw these numbers coming from my home state, I'd be here twice as fast." By now, the hearing was being streamed by every major network. What started as a procedural review had turned into something much bigger. And then came the final twist. Pam turned to a new category of data, housing initiatives. She revealed a property that received $2.4 million under an inclusive housing grant. But it wasn't a housing facility. It was a hotel, and it had been leased entirely for undocumented residents. No public logs. No ID checks. No transparency. Another site, same story. Millions in federal grants funneled into temporary housing centers that served no citizens, weren't publicly disclosed, and couldn't prove eligibility screening. She paused, then clicked to one last slide. Several enrichment programs funded by these grants, she said, no longer require legal ID or proof of residency. That means the American taxpayer is funding programs that, by design, can't be audited. Jasmine Crockett interjected, visibly tense. "Are you implying this was done to circumvent federal regulations?" Pam looked directly at her. "I'm not implying. I'm stating. These programs were structured in ways that deliberately avoid accountability." The room fell into silence. Even Crockett, ever the fighter, didn't respond. She just stared at the screen, taking it all in. And with that, Pam closed her folder. "This isn't about being progressive or conservative," she said. "It's about being honest. And today, the numbers are what they are." What started as a hearing ended as an indictment, not in a court of law, but in the court of public trust. And while Letitia James hadn't said a word, the rest of the country was already talking. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. $26 million vanished. Bondi's testimony rocks D.C. Letitia James silent as Pam Bondi drops bombshells in Congress. Are taxpayer dollars funding ghost programs? Cable news networks lit up. Podcasts scrambled for emergency uploads. Social media was aflame with clips, not just of the data dumps, but of Pam Bondi's calm, surgical delivery. Some called it a political ambush. Others called it the most important congressional oversight moment in years. But no one could ignore it. Pam Bondi, a former Florida Attorney General known for her tough stance on consumer fraud and organized crime, hadn't shouted. She hadn't gestured wildly. She hadn't even raised her voice. She didn't have to. The numbers spoke. The silence from Letitia James' office screamed louder. And yet, what came next wasn't a series of swift government investigations. It was something stranger. Slower. Murkier. By Friday, 4 nonprofit websites referenced in the testimony had gone offline. By Monday, local reporters trying to visit the grant recipient offices in Brooklyn and Buffalo were being told to leave the premises by security, unbadged, unofficial, and aggressive. Eric Delaney, the forensic accountant, had to relocate from his regular office. He told CNN that an unmarked vehicle had been seen parked near his house 3 nights in a row. Still, Pam Bondi didn't stop. In an exclusive with The Hill, she laid it out plainly. This isn't about taking down anyone's office. It's about restoring trust. If you fund programs with federal dollars, you don't get to hide behind progressive branding. You have to show results. You have to open the books. The following week, the House Oversight Committee reconvened. This time, Letitia James was subpoenaed. But the real surprise wasn't her. It was Jasmine Crockett. Crockett, a rising Democratic firebrand from Texas, had initially taken a defensive posture in the hearing. She was known for her quick wit and sharp tongue in debates, especially when challenging partisan theatrics. But something had shifted. She entered the hearing room with a manila folder. Her team had conducted a rapid internal review of several New York-based initiatives with funding ties to Texas-based nonprofits. She wasn't there to spin the narrative. She was there to do her job. "This is bigger than politics," she began. "It's about who gets helped and who gets hustled." Crockett proceeded to detail how 2 community outreach programs in Houston, which had received satellite funding from New York's Office of Restorative Equity, had also failed to report basic financials. One listed no board members. Another operated out of a P.O. box in a strip mall. The data mirrored what Bondi had revealed. But the most jarring moment came when Crockett turned the lens inward. "If this is happening here," she said, "then how many other states are using these vague platforms to bypass transparency altogether?" The room held its breath. Pam Bondi didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded. Because this, finally, was what she had come for. That moment of alignment. The understanding that oversight isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. Across the aisle, that realization was taking hold. A bipartisan proposal emerged within days, the Federal Program Transparency and Compliance Act, which would mandate uniform definitions for grant categories like equity, restorative justice, and community enrichment. Independent third-party audits for all federal-funded nonprofits exceeding $500,000 annually. Real-time public tracking of disbursed funds. Bondi publicly supported it. Crockett did too. Meanwhile, Letitia James, under increasing pressure, finally issued a public statement. "These attacks are politically motivated and aim to undermine critical programs for underserved communities." But the statement didn't include any data. No denial of the facts presented. No explanation for the missing audits. And as Pam Bondi pointed out on Meet the Press the following Sunday, if the programs are legitimate, why not show the receipts? Letitia James' office announced a review of grant disbursement procedures, a vague promise with no timeline. But the court of public opinion had already moved. State legislatures began filing FOIA requests for their own grant data. Reporters across the country were digging into local contracts and shell nonprofits. Activists on both sides were asking the same question. Where did the money go? And amid it all stood Pam Bondi, not as a politician chasing headlines, but as a prosecutor turned whistleblower, following the same instincts that made her one of the toughest AGs in Florida history. And Jasmine Crockett, no longer an opponent, but a necessary ally, had shown the courage to interrogate her own side. In a rare joint appearance, they sat down for a televised panel 2 weeks later. "This isn't about left or right," Bondi said. "It's about right and wrong," Crockett finished. And with that, the damage was done, not just to Letitia James' political armor, but to an entire system that had grown too comfortable hiding behind buzzwords. For the first time in years, Americans weren't arguing over whether corruption existed. They were demanding to know how deep it went. And the ripple effect, from New York to Nevada, from Congress to community boards, was only just beginning.